それでは定刻になりましたので、ただいまから第3回エネルギー情勢懇談会を開催いたします。本日は朝早くから委員の皆様、それから有識者の皆様におかれましてはお集まりいただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。まず最初に世耕経済産業大臣でございますが、本日は海外出張のため、この会合には出席ができません。大臣もくれぐれも委員の皆様によろしくというようにおっしゃっておられました。本日の会合の内容につきましては、我々の方からしっかりと世耕大臣にもお伝えをいたします。それから本日は飯島委員、それから白石委員はご欠席でございます。それから五上委員が5、6分ほどちょっと遅れるということでございますが、もう間もなく到着されるということかと思います。本日は地球温暖化対策を中心にご議論をいただきたいというように思います。前回と同様に、今回も海外から有識者の方にご参加をいただいております。ご意見をいただきながら議論を深め進めていきたいというように思います。最初に有識者の方をご紹介いたします。まずマイケル・シェレンバーガー氏でございます。シェレンバーガー氏は米国のエネルギー環境団体エンバラメンタルプログレスの代表でございます。同氏は地球温暖化対策の観点から原発の活用を問うたパンドラの約束という映画にご出演され、非常に話題にもなりました方でございます。それから、続きまして、ジムスキー教授でございます。英国インペリアルカレッジロンドンの教授でございまして、イギリス政府に対して2050年までの長期地球温暖化対策の枠組みを提言する気候変動委員会の委員を務められております。また、気候変動に関する政府間パネル IPCC でございますけれども、その議長も務められていらっしゃる方でございます。なお、実は今日ドイツからテレビ参加ということでございましたが、環境経済学者のクラウディア・ケンフェルト教授にご参加をいただく予定でございましたが、体調不良ということで、急に参加ができなくなりました。非常に残念でございますけれども、今回は資料の方の提出がございますので、事務方の方から説明をさせていただければというように思います。その上でまた改めて機会があればですね、委員の皆様のご了解いただきながら、ぜひ改めて参加の機会を探していきたいというように思います。さて本日の会合をより充実したものとするために、事前にですね、有識者の皆様には、委員の皆様からご意見をいただいた上で、質問事項というものを投げさせていただきました。資料4というものをご覧ください。質問事項温暖化対策ということでございまして、大きくポイント4つございます。まず、国際的な温暖化対策の長期方針につきまして、米国のパリ協定離脱、これが世界的な温室効果ガスの排出削減に与える影響を、これをどういうふうに考えるか、長期的に温室効果ガスを減らしていくためには、今後どのような取り組みが特に重要と考えるか、こういった視点でございます。それから再生可能エネルギーにつきましては、再生可能エネルギーを主力電源の一つということを目指していった場合に、政策支援をさまざま行っているわけでございますけれども、さらにその政策支援から自立して、本格的なその導入を進めるためには、どのような取り組みが必要であるか、あるいはそれに伴いまして、調整火力の確保、送電線の再構築、蓄電池の整備といった課題についてどのように対処していくべきかという質問を投げさせていただいております。原子力につきましては、低炭素化に向けた流れの中で原子力の意義、役割をどう考えるか、また、信頼の回復に向けてどのようなコミュニケーションが望ましいと考えるか、こういったご質問を投げかけております。電化と技術の可能性につきましては、電化についてさまざま英仏や中国において政策対応の方針が示されておりますけれども、EV の将来見込みをどのように評価しているか、 さらにそれ以外の分野についての省エネ低炭素化をどう考えるか。技術につきましては、長期的な低炭素化には技術開発とイノベーションが鍵となりますけれども、どのような技術に着目しているか、こういったご質問を投げさせていただいてございます。それから資料5としてですね、議論の参考にすると、一助となるため、するために、事務局の方から資料を用意してございます。本当にポイントをかいつまんでご紹介をいたします。目次というものがございますけれども、資料5をご覧ください。まずは2030年の CO2 排出量の世界的な規模感とターゲット、それから2050年に向けた主要国の戦略、それからゼロエミッション比率の現状、それから再生可能エネルギー、原子力、省エネの現状と課題、それからEV の政策対応の比較でございます。お手元大丈夫でございましょうか。ちょっとポイントだけご説明させていただきます。2ページをご覧ください。2ページは2030年の低炭素化へのターゲットということでございますが、まずグラフとして表としては、現在の CO2 排出量の規模感を示してございます。世界とアジアと日本をセクター別に示してございます。世界は大体今 CO2 の排出量は312億トン、アジアが136トン、日本は11億トン強ということでございます。セクター別には電力、運輸、産業、こういったところが多いわけでございまして、どこに削減のポテンシャルがあるかというものを示してございます。それから3ページをご覧ください。3ページは2050年に向けた主要国の長期戦略の概要でございます。米国、カナダ、フランス、イギリス、ドイツ示してございます。削減目標につきましては 80%、大体75から95の間で 80% 以上というものが多くございます。なお、これらにつきましては、例えば野心的なビジョンを示したものであるとか、方向性を提示したものであるとか、あり得る経路であるとか、いわばその計画には精緻なものではございませんけれども、方向性を示しているということでございます。主な戦略スタンスとして、ゼロエミッション化、省エネ、電化、海外貢献というものをそれぞれ示してございますが、方向性を示しながら柔軟性も確保しているというような内容になってございます。こうした主要国が、これらの具体化に向けてどう取り組んでいくかを見極め、そして日本としてどういう道行きで進めていくかが課題になろうかというように思います。それから少し飛ばしていただきまして、10ページをご覧ください。10ページはゼロエミッション比率の現状でございます。これは日米欧の比較をしてございます。日米欧ともゼロエミッション電源につきましては今後高めていく方向でございますけれども、例えば日本は現状2015年ゼロエミッション電源比率は 16% でございます。その隣、米国は 33%、それから EU がございまして、EU 平均は 56% と高いレベルになってございます。日本と米国の差というものは、これは再エネにつきましては、大体同じレベル、15、13% でございますけれども、原子力の割合、一番下でございますけれども、これが日本と米国の差になってございます。それから EU につきましては 56% と高いレベルになってございますが、これは再エネがそのうちの 29%、それから一番下の原子力、これが 27% 程度ということでございます。再エネと原子力が同じぐらいの割合になっているというものが現状でございます。ちなみにドイツにつきましては 44%、そのうち再エネが3割、29% という高いレベルまで来ておりまして、原子力一番下が 14% 程度という状況でございます。それから、14ページをご覧ください。 14ページは、これは EU の主要国と日本の電源における CO2 排出係数と発電構成というものを表記したものでございます。2015年ベースでございますが、右から3番目に EU 平均というものがございますが、その下に1キロワットアワーあたり311グラムの CO2 を排出している現状というものを示してございます。ちなみに日本は540グラムの排出となっておりまして、これは一番下にございますが、84% も化石燃料を現状使っていることが影響してございます。ドイツは EU と日本の間でございますけれども、450グラムということで、再燃の割合も高いわけでございますけれども、火力で石炭の割合がまだ高いということで、このくらいの CO2 の排出係数になってございます。ちなみにスウェーデン、フランスは、スウェーデンは水力を中心として、フランスは原子力を中心として、安定的なゼロエミッション電源が高いという状況にございます。したがって火力は低いということになってございます。真ん中に変動再エネのが比較的大きいデンマーク、スペイン、あるいはドイツが並んでございますが、これは最近拡大をしてございまして、こういった規模感に来てございますが、調整力も含めた火力もその下にございますけれども、相応の規模感を持っているということでございます。それから、19ページをご覧ください。19ページは、欧州と日本の国土面積あたりの発電量の比較でございます。国土面積あたりどのくらいの発電になっているかということを少し分析をしたものでございます。真ん中に電力需要密度ということを書いてありますが、これは国土面積あたりの総発電量がどうなっているかと、1平方キロメートルあたりの発電量でございますが、これは欧州の主要国に比べますと、日本はかなり高いレベル、270万キロワットアワーということになってございます。ドイツが180、スペイン、イタリアは2桁台というものでございます。従いまして、電源構成における太陽光、風力、水力の割合というのは、日本は比較的数字が小さくなってございます。3%、1%、9% ということでございます。ただ一方で、この国土面積あたりのこれらの発電量、太陽光、風力、水力の発電量を見ますと、これは一番左でございますけれども、太陽光が9万キロ、水力が23万キロ、風力はまだ小さくて1万キロワットアワーあたりでございます。太陽光はドイツ、イタリアと比べましても遜色がないレベルでございますし、水力は欧州の主要国に比べてもかなり高いレベルにあるということで、を示しているものでございます。それから一番最後でございます。24ページでございます。これは電気自動車の推進のための政策対応の強度の比較というものをしたものでございます。日本につきましては、2030年までに EV、PHV の新車販売を20から 30% 程度を目指す、こういう目標を経済産業省として立てているものでございます。一方、英国、フランスでは2040年までにガソリンディーゼル車の販売終了という方針を示している状況でございますし、中国も2019年からは EV、FCV、PHV の生産の一部を義務化するという方針を示してございます。なお、ドイツはそういった明確な方針は今のところは出してございません。米国につきましても、カリフォルニア州は規制がございますが、国全体としては、そういった方針はまだ示していないという状況でございます。以上でございます。それでは、これから有識者の方にプレゼンテーションをお願いしたいと思います。まず最初に、マイケル・シェレンバーガー氏、お願いをしたいと思います。
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, and this is a wonderful opportunity for me, and also a great honor. And in particular, very happy to have in the audience two colleagues who I respect very much, Mr. Funabashi-san, whose work on Fukushima I've benefited from enormously, and also my new friend Kyle Cleveland, a sociologist from Temple University, who has also done some important work on sort of a moral dimension to the Fukushima accident that I'll be referencing in my talk. So I'm going to make a pretty straightforward argument in three parts that will address the elements that were in the questionnaire but not in that order. The argument I'm going to make is that when it comes to dealing with climate change, there is no alternative to nuclear energy. And in particular, I'm going to argue that if we want to lift everybody out of poverty, mitigate the worst effects of climate change, and also ensure nuclear peace, we need a significant expansion of nuclear energy in the 21st century, and that there is no alternative either through geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, or renewables. There's some other elements of the presentation that I am going to add to the end in reflection of, I think, some of the priorities that I've seen discussed from Mehdi that I think are important. So I'll just start by saying that from my own personal experience, I began as a renewable energy advocate. My attraction to renewable energy had more to do with a kind of worldview than it did with any technical understanding. And in particular, I just fell in love with a particular idea of harmonizing humankind with the natural environment through renewable energy flows and technologies. And in particular, this vision of solar rooftops and electric cars, which I think is, in the United States at least, among those who are concerned about climate change and concerned about the natural environment, this is a very powerful way of thinking about the world, and people have a very hard time understanding why solar panels and electric cars would not be sufficient to dealing with climate change. That was my view around 2003 when I helped to lobby President Obama's political team to make a large investment in renewable energy. When he was elected in 2008, he took power at a time of the financial crisis, and they invested about $90 billion in a stimulus investment in all manner of clean energy technologies, including electric cars. And over about 10 years, the United States invested about $150 billion of public money. That doesn't count the private sector funding that followed the public investment as a consequence. I only began to rethink my views in 2005 when one of my childhood heroes, Stuart Brand, who was also featured in Pandora's Promise, wrote a famous essay where he said that we would need to have much more nuclear power to deal with climate change. And this came as a shock to many of us who consider ourselves left of center politically, concerned about the climate, because we had all assumed that renewables would be the way to deal with climate change. And the first thing that Stuart pointed out was that nuclear just produces very few carbon emissions. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, nuclear actually produces 4 times fewer carbon emissions than solar farms. Stuart also observed that nuclear was one of our largest sources of clean energy, and that after 4 decades of efforts, solar and wind still only generated a small amount of electricity. And just as I was starting to change my mind on nuclear, the Fukushima accident occurred. This was a bit of a test of my faith in nuclear. However, within about a month after the accident, it became clear from speaking with radiation scientists that there would not be harmful levels of radiation exposure from the Fukushima accident. And in fact, a British columnist named George Monbiot wrote a column just a month after Fukushima where he wrote, "The anti-nuclear movement to which I once belonged has misled the world about the impacts of radiation on human health." And this was an extraordinary column. In fact, he was being advised at the time by Dr. Geraldine Thomas, who is a professor at Imperial College, along with Professor Skia. And she knew from her work in Chernobyl, but also from the radiation measurements at Fukushima, that there would not be significant health impacts. And my colleagues and I could feel some pressure to speak out of some concern that the Fukushima accident could result in a decline in nuclear power rather than the increase that we felt we needed. And so I'll just review a few numbers that are very familiar to you that put some of the the thinking that we had at the time in context. Japan's electricity obviously became much dirtier after the closure of the nuclear plants and replacement with coal and other fossil fuels. Japan's share of clean electricity went from about almost 30% to a small fraction of that. And of course, the big impacts on the economy felt very strongly in Japan, with the trade balance going from a surplus to a deficit. And you can see these numbers might be a little different from yours, but basically what this shows is that there's great uncertainty about Japan's energy future, largely because it's just not clear how much of your nuclear fleet will be restarted. We just did an analysis that was published in the New York Times of what I think is a natural experiment between two major periods of investment in different low-carbon technologies. The first one was in nuclear from 1962 to 2016. The world, both the public and the private sector, invested about 1.8, nearly 2 trillion in nuclear power over about a 56-year period. And then over the last 10 years alone, we invested almost the same amount in solar and wind combined. And so this provides a useful natural experiment to evaluate the effect that those deployments had on carbon intensity of the economy. The New York Times wrote about this last week, noting that my organization, Environmental Progress, performed an analysis of the evolution of the carbon intensity of energy in 68 countries since 1965. It found no correlation between the additions of solar and wind power and the carbon intensity of energy. Despite the additions of renewable capacity, carbon intensity remained flat. And you can see here, this is a very simple model. It's really just data showing the correlation between the deployment of hydroelectricity and nuclear on the carbon intensity of energy and the lack of a correlation between solar and wind. And if you wonder why that might be, you can just see it in the chart. Just the solar and wind just did not produce enough electricity to decarbonize the energy sectors. And so the one response might be, well, we just didn't deploy enough solar and wind, but that's belied by the fact that we made this very significant investment in these two energy sources, and we're not seeing either the electrical generation or the carbon intensity declines that we saw from nuclear and hydro. This chart also gives a clue to it. This just takes the largest periods, the largest 10-year period of deployment of each of those four technologies. And you can see in the yellow and the red, solar and wind just generated a lot less electricity than did hydro and nuclear, often more on the order of somewhere between 3 and 10 times as much power. Let's take a closer look at Germany. Germany is considered the global leader in renewables with good reason. They alone invested $222 billion in renewables since 2000. That's more than the United States invested, despite being a smaller economy. We saw that their electricity prices rose very significantly, 50% over the last 10 years. And yet the share of German electricity from coal remains very high at 40%, with nuclear still providing 13% of their power. And we also see that German electricity is twice as expensive than French electricity. Now, the official discourse, including the one promoted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is that higher electricity prices are likely going to be necessary to decarbonize economies. And so you would expect, by looking at this chart, that the German economy would have a lower carbon intensity than the French economy. In fact, France has over twice as much clean energy generated electricity than does Germany. And so after this very large investment in renewables, at a countrywide level, we can see we're not seeing a significant change to the electricity sector. And German emissions have been rising now since 2009. And in fact, one of the leading German think tanks 2 days ago published an analysis that predicts that emissions will rise again this year. And I think it's also safe to predict that they will rise again in 2018, given their nuclear phase-out proposals. And it was a very awkward situation. I was in Bonn with the climate scientist James Hansen, And there was all this talk about how Germany needed to reduce its use of coal. At the same time, they're in the midst of relocating an entire village of people so that they can build another large coal mine underneath. And the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about was the fact that it's largely due to the phase out of nuclear. Well, let's take a closer look at renewables. Last year, Germany installed 4% more solar panels, but generated 3% less electricity from solar. I'm often in rooms with energy experts, and I'll ask people if they can predict why that is, and nobody can guess why the answer is. The answer is very simple. It was just not very sunny last year in Germany. Now, the argument that advocates of renewables have given is that that's okay because the years that it's not sunny, it will be windier, and so we'll be able to get more electricity from wind. Well, in fact, Germany installed 11% more wind turbines in 2016, but generated 2% less electricity from wind. The same reason, it just wasn't very windy. Now, what are the implications on this for the economy? This is a study that was done by a German analyst named Leon Hirth, who has very strong anti-nuclear credentials. And what he finds is that the market value of wind declines 40% as wind reaches 30% of electricity generation. Solar drops 50% when it reaches just 15% of generation. That's just because solar and wind are generating too much power when we don't need them and not enough power when we do. What about backup storage? I'm from California, which is really the world's leader in battery technologies, and we calculated how much battery storage and utility scale storage do we have, and that amount is 23 minutes to back up the entire grid. But that would require using every battery in every car and truck in the state, which would not be very practical if you want to drive. Now, to really peel this onion a little further, to really try to understand what's behind this, I think it's worth considering some of the mechanisms that make renewables generate so little power relative to their cost. So the first thing is, as Mr. Ozawa noted in his presentation, I thought very impressive statistics on the land density of energy in Japan and other countries. Renewables require about 17 to 35 times more land than nuclear. We look at materials. This often surprises people. Advocates of solar tend to imagine that solar reduces humankind's environmental impact. In fact, solar requires significantly more mining of materials. You can see in the form of steel, concrete, glass, and cement. And you sort of start to get a picture that the low energy density of these fuels requires spreading the collectors of these dilute or diffuse fuels over a much larger expanse of land. And incidentally, while the efficiency of a solar panel can be improved, you cannot make sunlight more energy dense, nor can you make it more reliable. I think this is one of the most interesting comparisons. This is a look comparing the material requirements of different energy sources with energy return on energy invested. We like the measurement of energy return on energy invested because it's a physical measure, and so you're not allowing confusions to be introduced into the analysis from economic questions. So often people point out that solar panels have gotten a lot cheaper, but it's not clear that that's from any significant change to energy return on energy invested, or whether that's simply a function of the Chinese taking advantage of mass manufacturing of panels and even the subsidization and dumping of these panels. And so you can see there's a strong correlation between the large materials demands of renewables and the low energy return on energy invested, with the exception of hydro, which is a one-time gain that nations can make in their electricity sector, but after that, very difficult to scale further. And this leads to a troubling conclusion, which is that solar panels actually produce 300 times more toxic waste than nuclear energy does per unit of energy. And this may seem surprising, but it's actually a logical conclusion from the materials throughput. This is a very simple analysis. This is just simply measuring how much solar panel do you have after a 25 or 30-year life of that panel. Those panels all have to go somewhere. They have to be disposed. Right now, only Europe has a disposal regulation requiring the safe disposal of solar. Everywhere else in the world, solar panels will join the electronic waste stream and likely be taken apart in poor communities around the world, exposing the local residents to toxins including lead, cadmium, and chromium. And when I point this out to my anti-nuclear friends, they point out, well, but radiation lasts for hundreds of thousands of years, and I point out that cadmium, chromium, and lead last forever, since they're elements on the periodic table. Their toxicity never declines. And more importantly, there is no safe containment of these panels, whereas we safely contain the spent nuclear fuel, the used nuclear fuel. So is there an alternative to nuclear? I want to talk about three alternatives that are much discussed. I think they're easy to discard as serious alternatives for dealing with climate change. The first is carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage must always be more expensive than the fossil fuels that they are being added on to. Unless there's some new significant demand for carbon, which would of course not be sequestered, they're going to be more expensive. They're going to involve a huge amount of piping and essentially a significant energy penalty from the combustion of coal and gas. So countries like Vietnam, which decided to not build out nuclear and instead build out coal, in part due to fears of nuclear, in part due to lower energy demand, and in part due to fears and cost, countries like Vietnam would not do carbon capture and storage as an alternative to nuclear. They would just burn coal. Discussion by some of my friends, I think very well-meaning discussions of an international supergrid, maybe connected to Russia from Japan. There's similar discussions in Europe. There are ideas of bringing power from North Africa to Europe. This raises very significant energy security problems that I just think are insurmountable. There's a reason why energy tends to be produced at national scales and not internationally, with some important exceptions, Denmark being the important outlier in the production of significant quantities of wind electricity is really due to the fact that it's part of a regional grid. And you can see Germany handling much of its overproduction of solar and wind by dumping its electricity when it's not needed on its neighbors, but already that's encountering significant problems. I think the idea of being dependent on foreign countries so centrally for your electricity, not simply for your fuels, is something that most national security and energy security experts would reject as quite dangerous and risky. And finally, geoengineering. Some of the advocates are very close friends of mine. Does not actually cool the Earth permanently. It's a short-term fix, and it risks creating as many new problems as it solves. It's not clear at all how such a decision will be made to geoengineer. It's hard to imagine it being made democratically, and the negative consequences would be felt by probably the most vulnerable nations, including African nations that suffer the most already from poverty and agricultural insecurity. These are all familiar numbers to you, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I would just note that when you show people the facts about Chernobyl and Fukushima, they're always surprised. Most people don't know that fewer than 200 people are predicted to die from the Chernobyl accident. That's according to the United Nations Scientific Committee for the Study of Atomic Radiation. These are slides I borrowed from Geraldine Thomas at Imperial College, but they're all taken directly from the United Nations. Similarly with Fukushima, the real consequences, as the excellent reports on Fukushima show, were from the panicked evacuation, which largely resulted from radiophobia. Some of those evacuations, of course, evacuated people directly into where some of the radioactive steam was being vented. And so what we find is that other risks just simply outweigh significantly any of the additional risks of radiation from Chernobyl. This is one of the most striking findings. Just living in a big city with a lot of pollution increases your mortality risk greater than if you were one of the firefighters who put out the Chernobyl reactor fire. People say, well, how do we know? how do we know what the effects of radiation will be? It's so uncertain. We've been studying radiation for over a century. We have so much data on radiation. We can make these estimates based on exposure and also by following the Chernobyl cohort as they've been doing ever since the accident. And of course, 7 million people die annually from air pollution, both from the combustion of fossil fuels and also biomass. So every major study that's looked at mortality from energy finds that nuclear is the safest way to make reliable electricity. This is just one of the most recent reputable ones from the British medical journal Lancet. And this led to the climate scientist James Hansen conducting a study where he finds that nuclear power has in fact saved nearly 2 million lives by averting the combustion of fossil fuels. None of that, of course, counts the impact of climate change on lives in the future. We can see just Germany alone in their radiophobic avoidance of nuclear power exports coal pollution to the rest of Europe, and according to the World Wildlife Fund, which is no fan of nuclear, results in the premature deaths of nearly 2,500 people a year. This is the nuclear waste. I used to think it was liquid and green because I got my information from television, particularly The Simpsons. I now understand that it's solid, but when I interview people about nuclear waste and ask what they're afraid that it will spill. So there's literally there's not just that people are ignorant. It's not the case that people are ignorant about nuclear. It's the case that they have the wrong facts in their minds. So where are we at today? Obviously, Fukushima has had an international impact. Fukushima makes my work as a nuclear advocate more difficult. It affects everything. On social media and in real life, when we tell people that we favor nuclear, they just say one word, Fukushima, which is meant to signify that nuclear is unacceptable. So this is clearly a big challenge that is of concern to the whole world, not just to Japan. And there's two particular issues of concern, I think, that linger. The first is the soil cleanup. The second is the continued retention of tritiated water. I know that the soil cleanup is viewed as a significant success in Japan. I was on a Discovery documentary being interviewed about it. However, the science on it is pretty clear. The levels of soil contamination were far too low to have impacts on human health. In fact, the levels of radiation in my home state of Colorado were twice as high as some of the most affected areas of Fukushima. And when I pressed the Ministry of the Environment on this question, he said, well, we Japanese like things very clean, and we wanted to sort of do something to show our concern. And I appreciate the sentiment, and I appreciate Japanese culture and what the government has done to clean up, but I think that that cleanup has also reinforced the sense that radiation is a super potent toxin, when we know at low levels it simply is not. As a consequence, we've seen a long-term decline from nuclear that's accelerated since Fukushima. Our calculation is that the world could lose twice as much nuclear as it gains between now and 2030. And as troubling, the global marketplace for nuclear is being rapidly taken over by Russia. I don't think Russia's aims are benevolent on nuclear. The people that I speak to are quite concerned about Russia's aggressive role in financing, owning, and controlling nuclear power plants. Its behavior as it related to natural gas following its intervention or during its intervention in Ukraine give reason to believe that it views energy as a tool of its international policy. And obviously, on an economic level, takes away a significant export market from countries like Japan, the United States, and France, which have been excellent providers of nuclear reactors around the world. Japan in particular has a design that I think is a very good design, the Hitachi Advanced Boiling Water Reactor. Unless you believe I'm advertising for anybody, we don't take any funding from any industry or interest group. And I've already said enough mean things about Japan that you'll know that I'm not being nice. The BWR has a negative reputation because of Fukushima, but the Advanced Boiling Water Reactor is is the only advanced design to be built on time and on budget. Areva's European Pressurized Reactor is what a friend of mine calls unconstructible, And the Westinghouse AP1000, well, you know the story, led to the bankruptcy of Westinghouse and significant losses for Toshiba. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I think that there's more to do. So let me wrap up by offering some ideas for a way forward that leans into the challenges of Fukushima. I'm very impressed by the Japanese government and society's response to Fukushima. 2 excellent reports were done, one by Funabashi-san and the other by Kiyoshi Kurakawa-san. And they both point to very similar factors. I read both of the reports, and I also interviewed both gentlemen. Both were extremely direct and blunt with the problems that led to Fukushima, overconfidence that Japan couldn't suffer from a nuclear accident, thus little to no accident preparedness. And I thought one of the most interesting parts of it was that what was driving some of that was actually fear of the public's fear of radiation. So why didn't they raise the seawall? They didn't want to alarm the local community. Why didn't they want to do emergency preparedness? They didn't want to frighten people. That seems strange to me. I understand it now, but if I got onto an airplane and they decided not to do the safety talk, I would be more afraid. I think that it all stems from the belief that radiation was a superpotent toxin at low levels, and the paternalism that said we will protect you from radiation actually reinforced the sense that this radiation was a superpotent toxin. So when it became clear that there would be a radioactive release, there was an overreaction. This was, of course, so I think the nuclear safety myth rests, in fact, on 3 pillars. This underlying radiophobia. Obviously, I don't mean to diminish the real dangers of radiation. If you are right next to a reactor, you will get cancer and die. I mean, that is what happened to the 28 firefighters that were killed after they put out the Chernobyl fire. But low levels of radiation, we do not see any impact on human health. The paternalism that the government will protect us, and then the arrogance that we are different and special from other countries. And so when the accident occurs, the public lost trust and it panics. Now, the bottom photograph is from the visitor center of a nuclear plant in Japan, at Shika, Japan. But the 2 photos above are from a visitor center in South Korea that's making all of the same mistakes that were made here, and I should say are also made in the United States. The United States is no better on this issue. The visitor center in South Korea, when I asked them, what do you say when people ask you about Fukushima, the guide, he said, well, we point out that we don't have BWRs, we don't have boiling water reactors, we have pressurized water reactors. And I thought, wow, there's not a lot of solidarity with your Japanese colleagues. And then they said, and they showed a map of Japan, they said, see, they have much worse earthquakes and tsunamis, therefore an accident won't happen here. As opposed to saying, well, there might be an accident, just like a jet plane might crash. But if there is, we'll handle it appropriately, and the most important thing is not to panic. So there's 2 panics. Funabashi-san in the testimony of the operator notes that an elite panic is when governmental elites panic, fearing the public panic. And the example, of course, is the former Prime Minister's interference in the chain of command. But I think that I think it's important not to blame Prime Minister Khan. The ingredients that led to the panic were sowed many years prior, really the failure of public education and engagement that led to these pre-existing superstitious beliefs of fears of radiation. My new friend Kyle Cleveland, professor here in Japan, wrote a brilliant academic paper describing Fukushima as a moral panic. And a moral panic is when you blame already distrusted members of society for things that are out of their control. So the famous example of a moral panic is in the United States when we burned women who were doctors, healers in the 17th century as witches, blaming them for natural disasters. I think the moral panic in Japan after Fukushima was blaming people for an accident that in some ways was really not their fault. So both reports argue for a change to institutional culture. I clarified with Funabashi-san, and you can correct me if I misrepresent you. This is not about changing institutions. It's not exactly about changing Japanese culture. It's about changing the culture within the institutions. One remedy or one solution for this that's often proposed is to cultivate generational change by empowering the young leaders in those institutions to approach the world slightly differently. So I know I'm out of time, so I'll wrap up in 1 minute. In this lovely movie that came out a couple of years ago called Sully, a jet plane has just taken off from an airport in New York, and it loses both of its engines to bird strikes. The response from the pilot was to have everybody shelter in place, don't panic, and they landed the plane safely. And I think it's a powerful metaphor for nuclear. Jet planes are going to crash. Nuclear plants are going to have meltdowns and accidents. So we should do everything we can to prevent that, but we also need to make sure that we respond appropriately when they do. We should try to make nuclear reactors safer, and we should recognize that as much as we would like to have accident-proof jet planes, we will always have accidents. And so I think there's a maturation of human society in the face of these accidents to be a bit more understanding and not panic when they do occur. And I think it also means a more humanistic view of nuclear. I asked a risk inspector who's actually based in Japan what he makes of Diablo Canyon, which is California's last nuclear plant. He said, it's a great plant. I said, what makes you say that? And he said, because the people that work there care. So it wasn't about the machines. It's about the ethic. It's about the institutional culture. And so this is the face of nuclear I think we need to present. It's a face of a person in the control room, just like when we walk onto the airplane and we look to the control room, we see a captain, we see a person that we think is responsible, and what makes us feel safe is the culture itself. It's the institutional culture. It's not the machines. So it's not what makes nuclear safe, it's who makes it safe. And I think there's a lot we can do. I gave a talk recently. They asked the audience beforehand, do you think nuclear is a solution to the world's environmental problems? 40% agreed, 30% disagreed. After the talk, the numbers went up to 70%. Now you might think that's in the United States, that's with somebody that's not in the industry, but Korea shows that attitudes can change very rapidly. The South Korean president wanted to phase out nuclear. He convened a citizens' jury, and over a 3-month period and then a compressed 3 days, the citizens, which was a 471-member panel, heard presentations from both sides, and a nuclear engineering professor made the final presentation using very similar facts and charts like the ones I presented here, and support for continued construction of nuclear went from 40% to 60% over time. The motivations were slightly different than the motivations in the United States. They had more to do with energy scarcity and security than they did with climate change, but I think it's a testament to the power of reason and facts and dialogue to shift attitudes. And I'll just end by emphasizing that really only nuclear can achieve the goals that we all care about. In that sense, I think it has transcendent moral purpose. Only nuclear can lift all humans out of poverty while saving the natural environment and creating nuclear peace on Earth. Thank you again.
ありがとうございました。非常に包括的なご説明をいただきました。ありがとうございます。それでは続きまして、ジムスキー教授にお願いをしたいと思います。すみません、質疑は後でまとめてということでお願いいたします。
Well, while we're getting the presentation set up, I'd first of all like to start by thanking METI and the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy for the invitation to come to Japan. I was recalling that my first ever IPCC meeting was here in Tokyo, and it was coordinated by METI, and since then I've had many opportunities to come back and made many friends here, so it's good to see old friends here on this trip and hopefully make some new ones. Now, the presentation I'm going to give is a little bit different from Michael's. What I'm going to do is give a fairly factual account of the situation in the UK regarding energy and mid-century climate strategies. And in doing so, I will be able to touch on all but one of the questions that was put forward by Meti in introducing this. So this will be in two parts, really. The first part, I'm going to look at the overall legal framework and the economy-wide climate strategy. And then in the second half, I will focus on the electricity sector specifically. I might just say that we sometimes over-focus on electricity. It is not the only part of the economy. There's heat, there's transport, there's land use and agriculture as well, and we must never forget these. But electricity is indeed extremely important. So I'm going to start with the overall legal framework in the UK, and we passed a Climate Change Act in 2008, so we've got almost 10 years experience with it now. And very first section of it places a legal binding obligation on the government to get emissions to a level that is 80% lower by 2050 than was the case in 1990. If there are questions, I can say what legally binding means. That's an interesting concept in itself, but it is written into law, this 80% target. And the second part of the framework is the government needs to set a set of successive 5-year carbon budgets that move you towards that long-term 2050 target. And at any one time, there have to be 3 consecutive carbon budgets in legislation, so 15 years worth of direction in place. Now, this kind of summarises what the overall framework looks like. First of all, there's a mid-century goal, the 2050 emissions target. There's a pathway which is set by the carbon budgets, and the Committee on Climate Change on which I sit recommends these budgets, but the government has to put them before Parliament and get the budgets through Parliament. There's what you might call a toolkit. The government is required to introduce strategies and plans for making sure the carbon budgets are met. And then there's a monitoring framework, because every year the Committee on Climate Change reports to Parliament on the government's progress and it's whether it is likely that the carbon budgets will be met. So it's a very robust framework, and it is actually ensured that climate policy has retained a very high political profile, even in spite of quite significant different political changes over the last 10 years. Now, I will run through these. I don't need to go through these very quickly. I have 2 slides to explain why we got to an 80% target, and that was the first recommendation of the Committee on Climate Change. The starting point was a global objective based on the science to say that we should have a 50-50 chance of keeping global temperature rises below 2 degrees centigrade, taking account of the uncertainty issues. And then, following from that, there was the question about what would be the UK's equitable share of that global objective. And after a lot of consideration of different methodologies and moral aspects, we came up to the simplest possible solution that the UK's per capita emissions in 2050 should be the same as the global average. And once you've worked through global population projections, UK population projections, it's fairly simple arithmetic to get to the 80% reduction. That's where it actually came from. Now, this shows where we are in terms of the UK's carbon budgets and our path to 2050. The black line on the left-hand side of the screen, this shows actual emissions since 1990, and we are already down to around a 36–37% reduction. We are going for an 80% reduction in 2050, and in the 5th carbon budgets, which has now been set and which covers the period 2028 to 2032, the aim is to have a 57% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to the 1990 level. Now, we're already beginning to get some experience with the achievement of the carbon budgets. So in Carbon Budget 1, which ran from 2008 to 2012, we slightly over-complied with the carbon budget. We had about 1 or 2% to spare. We are now working our way, getting towards the end of, very much towards the end of the period of the second carbon budget, and here we expect there to be significant over-compliance. There will be a lot of spare overachievement of the second carbon budget, and our projections are that the same will be the case for the third carbon budget. Where it gets much tougher is where we go into the fourth and fifth carbon budgets for the mid-2020s and 2030, where there's a significant jump in ambition. And at the moment, we don't have all the policies in place that would allow these fourth and fifth carbon budgets to be met. And this is the kind of analysis that the Committee on Climate Change carries out every year in its report to Parliament, where we've got increasingly paid attention to the certainty with which policies can be delivered to effect change. So the solid line at the top is kind of the baseline, business as usual emissions projection. The dotted line is the least cost path towards the 2050 target. And what we do is classify that gap into three different types. Policies that we are very certain will deliver their objective, which is the green. The orange is policies which there is some risk attached to. They're not perfectly formulated, the funding has not been allocated, though the objectives may have been set. And the red is the policy gap. So it's effectively a traffic light system to look at the status of the policies that will deliver the objective. Now, the way that the government is obliged under the Climate Change Act to produce that kind of toolkit, the plan or the strategy that will lead towards the targets being met. And recently, just last month, the government produced the Clean Growth Strategy, which is the document that sets out how it hopes to achieve the fifth carbon budget by 2030. And this replaces a previous document, the Carbon Plan, which came out, I think, in 2009, or no, 2000, a bit later than that was intended to deliver the fourth carbon budget. And I want to flag up two things about that. First of all, a plan has turned into a strategy, which has all sorts of political implications behind it. A strategy is a broader kind of concept. And secondly is that the word carbon has disappeared to be replaced with clean growth. Now this is quite symbolic because it tells you about the government's economic concerns about the way in which a climate strategy will be developed. So this move from a carbon plan to a clean growth strategy is actually one that's quite important symbolically in terms of moving things forward. Now, the Clean Growth Strategy is very proud of the UK's progress so far. So we're looking at the growth of gross domestic product for the G7 and for the UK, very similar over the period 1990 to 2015. But the plan is proud of the fact that UK emissions have come down by that kind of 42% level by 2016 on the best estimates, whereas the G7 emissions have come down by a very small amount. Now, I would flag very clearly that there are two factors that have really helped to get UK emissions down, especially during the 1990s. One was changes in industrial structure. We have seen considerable downscaling in energy-intensive industry, especially in iron and steel, which has played a significant role in emissions reduction. And the second factor has been the very rapid move from coal-fired generation to gas-fired generation during the 1990s. And this had a very significant effect on UK emissions. So they're a very important factor. And a lot of the achievement, in fact, came in before the Climate Change Act in 2008. Now, the government in the Clean Growth Strategy has put out its estimates of how emissions would be sectorally distributed by the time we get to the fifth carbon budget in 2028 to 2032. And I won't go through all the details in it, but this compares the government's main strategy with the one which the Committee on Climate Change that I sit on thinks is the cost-effective path. And they are broadly similar, but I want to flag up two specific differences. One is in the transport sector here in the green, where the Committee on Climate Change expects and would anticipate a much faster movement to electric vehicles than would be the case for government. And then in the power sector, the government is actually much more ambitious about getting emissions down in the power sector than the Committee on Climate Change has been. Other than that, they are broadly similar in terms of strategies. Worthwhile saying that the government wants to be very clear that there is no one path that we can be certain about as far as 15 years into the future. So it sets out three alternative pathways to 2030. One that's focused on electrification of demand, which would involve faster move to electric vehicles. One which is based on heavier use of hydrogen as an energy vector, and one which places a greater emphasis on carbon dioxide removal and the use of carbon capture, utilisation and storage technologies. So it's acknowledging that we can't know all the detail in the future. We need to plan for different kinds of contingencies. Now, the other thing I wanted to flag up is that currently the quantified policies that the government has set out in the Clean Growth Strategy are not sufficient to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. So in that traffic lights diagram I showed you, there would still be part of it that is flashing red in terms of delivery. But one of the points that the government makes it, first of all, I'll come on to it, it places a lot of faith in innovation to deliver new technologies. But there is also a provision in the Climate Change Act whereby excess compliance with one carbon budget can be carried over to the subsequent carbon budget, thus taking off the pressure further down the line. So this line here shows the results, how much over-compliance there is in carbon budgets 1, 2 and 3, negative numbers, but at the moment on the planned policies we have under-compliance in budgets 4 and 5, hence positive numbers. But if you can carry over from one budget to another, these are the cumulative surpluses, and you have surpluses right through to the fifth carbon budget at that point. So the government has made a point here that it actually would be willing to make use of these flexibility mechanisms. Now, the Committee on Climate Change has not yet considered this, but my personal view, and I think one that the committee might well come to, is that it would argue against making excessive use of these flexibilities because it would reduce the level of effort below the levels to keep you on the path towards 2050. And this is a kind of discussion that the committee has had on a number of different occasions. And this slide is just really summarising the fact that the policies and the proposals in the Clean Growth Strategy still leave quite a large policy gap. Now, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that the strategy emphasises the role of innovation in filling the policy gap. So there's a lot of emphasis in the strategy about creating the right framework in which the private sector will innovate and bring new technologies forward. But the plan does also indicate the amount that the UK government in the public sector is willing to put into research and development and investment in technology over the period of the plan. It's about £2.6 billion sterling over the period 2016 to 2021, and about 45% of that would go into basic and applied research and development, 35% into technology development, and 20% into technology demonstration projects. Now, this for me personally is an interesting mix because demonstration and technology development are more expensive, and I might have expected a profile that was a little more towards the technology development and demonstration end, particularly if you're thinking about technologies like carbon capture and storage, which would need demonstration at this stage. And in terms of that 2.6 billion, about a third of it is directed towards the transport sector, including electric vehicles, about a quarter of it towards power generation, and 10% towards smart grids and networks. These are the biggest items that are sitting there in the technology profile. I think a particular issue for the UK, and I guess we'll get into this when we talk about it later, given Michael's remarks on carbon capture and storage. The UK, about 2 years ago, pulled back from a major investment in a demonstration project in carbon capture and storage at a power plant, which would have applied CCS to about 300 megawatts of gas-fired power capacity. The Chancellor of the Exchequer pulled back from that on expense grounds. And there is some ambition within the strategy to recover a little bit of the ground on carbon capture and storage. But please be aware that the word use has now appeared in the carbon capture and storage acronym. It's now CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage. So this is starting to look for uses of carbon, for example, for synthetic fuels, other kinds of issues. So the ground has actually expanded the scope of this. And just one final slide on the overall strategy and legal framework. What is very helpful and very good about the Clean Growth Strategy is that there's a very detailed annex on timetables for policy development and what needs to be achieved by when, what are the milestones. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is an example of the one that is set out for household energy use. So this is not electricity. This is trying to fix Britain's thermally leaky homes, which anybody who's been to the UK will understand all about. So home heating is a major kind of issue. But for every sector of the economy, there are these kind of timetables about when policies will need to be put in place. So that's covering the overall economy-wide strategy, and I'd now like at this point to turn to the electricity sector specifically. And the very strong message here, the UK power sector is very much decarbonising. These are carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector between 1990 and up to 2016 estimated. They're provisional numbers. And you can see the huge reduction in emissions that took place in the 1990s through the coal to gas switch, but also more recently, again as coal has come off the system, and also as we've invested in renewable energy, which has made a difference. So this is the electricity consumption overall, and you can see our electricity demand peaked around 2005. It's starting to come down now for various reasons. And as a combination of that with the emissions intensity, that's the number of grams of carbon dioxide emitted per kilowatt hour of generation. This has also come down very significantly, especially just in the last 3 or 4 years. So this combination of electricity demand plus the emissions intensity is leading to this very significant reduction in power sector emissions. And this diagram, which is, I took it from a screenshot from a very good website, which I would recommend, but it's very effective, is to demonstrate, this is the last 12 months of electricity generation in the UK. So I pulled that down last week. So that runs from basically November 2016 to early November 2017. And the big message is that, you know, nearly 50% of the UK system is now zero carbon. And this is resulting in a very low overall emissions intensity, which is now 238 grams per kilowatt hour. And recalling the presentation we were shown at the beginning, that's less than half the Japanese emissions intensity. So of the zero carbon, the biggest chunk is nuclear, which was about 7.7 gigawatts on average over the year. But the second chunk was this blue part here, which is wind energy, and solar is the yellow part here. So solar plus wind is sitting at about, on average, generating around 6 gigawatts, and nuclear on 7.7. I should say we also have quite a lot of biomass, which counts as zero carbon as well. The biggest chunk is gas, gas generation, but I want to also flag out the bit at the top, which is coal-fired generation, and it disappeared in the middle of the last 12 months. The UK has now, to all intents and purposes, exited from coal generation, and all of the fossil fuel is now being fitted up by gas. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that we have a carbon price floor, so generation faces a carbon tax. That's one reason why coal is gone. And the other one is that under European Union air quality legislation, coal plants in the UK, many of them had a limited number of hours of operation, and when they came to that limit, the plants effectively had to shut down. So that's the explanation. UK is now effectively coal-free in terms of its electricity generation. Now, one thing I want to flag also is about the economics of the different low carbon, and I won't go through it all, but we now have a framework where we have requirements for renewable energy, which is largely driven by the European Union's Renewable Energy Directive, where we now, because we have been concerned about the high costs of renewable energy, we now have auctions so that bids for renewable energy are competitively tensioned. And it's done in a way so people bid for a strike price. They still participate in the wholesale market, but they get paid the difference between the wholesale market price and the strike price in the contract for difference. And this is seen as a way of keeping people competing competitive tension in the market. Now, the latest auctions that came through included a price for offshore wind, which was, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, at a price of £120 per megawatt hour, compared with an average wholesale price, which is about 45 at the moment. The latest bid came through at, and astounded people that it came through for offshore wind at £57.50 per megawatt hour, which is getting very, very close to the average wholesale price. That doesn't take count of intermittency and variability, which we can talk about later, but if you turn that difference into a carbon tax, it's roughly £35 sterling per tonne, which is not an unreasonable, kind of bridge between the two parts of it. So we have seen extraordinary drops in the prices at which renewables has been bid into the system. And the guess is that offshore wind can probably be subsidy-free by the early to mid-2020s. And this was significantly cheaper than the strike price that was gone for the Hinkley Point nuclear plant, which was settled at £92.50 per megawatt hour back in 2013, and inflation will have already taken that up. So that compares with the £57.50. So there have been quite extraordinary changes in the price at which renewable energy is available. And the system is taking the strain. This is 1 week where renewable energy, in June this year, where renewable energy met 50% of demand, and this has been achieved without threatening the security of supply. There is enough gas on the system to effectively back it up. Now, these are complicated diagrams I will certainly not go into an explanation of, but this is based on projections that my colleagues in the electrical engineering department at Imperial College have been doing, which looks at what might happen if we continue to expand renewable energy during the 21st century. This is a mid-century one. And the key point is that what they're trying to get to, we now have an important measure, which is net demand for electricity, which is actual consumer demand minus the energy that is supplied by variable renewables. And that then is the demand that other forms of energy need to supply. So this purple curve here is the projected net demand for a period out in 2050. And the very important point there, it's not just that you need to back it up, it's that demand gets much more spiky. The peaks are shorter and there are much steeper ramp-ups of demand and much steeper falling away. And this is an extremely important part of a renewable system that has a lot of renewables in it. And for that reason, there is now a lot of interest in the evolution towards a much smarter energy system, a lot of emphasis on that in the UK, about managing better the interaction between demand and supply. I might also say that the energy sector has been very slow and incremental in innovation over the last few decades, but the rate of innovation has speeded up very considerably over the last few years. And I would flag up two factors. It's not just that people are being more inventive in the energy sector. The energy sector can take advantage of wider trends in innovation and new technologies. So the digital economy has big implications for the energy sector and how you can manage an energy system. And equally, there are big advances in material science, which has implications right across the energy sector, whether it's material for wind turbine blades, fuel cells, photovoltaic cells, or indeed the materials for nuclear power. There are really big advances. Scientists can now design a material rather than discovering it, and that is making really quite a big difference. So we now envisage a system, a smart future, where different forms of generation are coming in at different levels, high voltage, medium and low voltage, that demand can be much more responsive, and there are two-way flows of information between the different levels of the energy system. And I might say that in the past, when we had vertically integrated utilities, a lot of the innovation came from the generation part of these big vertically integrated companies. We have now unbundled in the UK, and it means there is now space for the distribution and transmission companies to be much more innovative. So we expect to see innovation taking place in the structure of the system, not just in the generation part of it. These are very detailed slides, which I'll skip, but I would flag up that this BEIS stands for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is the department in the UK that looks after energy. But it produced a smart energy plan in the middle of this year, which first of all looks at the networks and the storage side of it. It wants to define electricity storage as a form of generation and bring it fully into the mechanisms we have for balancing markets. And it also contains a big element on what is happening with consumers. So rolling out smart meters to every home that can respond potentially, setting standards for smart appliances to make sure that there's interoperability, so fridges, freezers, etc. can respond to market signals instantly. And also a new automated and electric vehicles bill, which will include provisions for building up smart electric vehicle charging structures. And I might say there on the transport side, this question of automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles is incredibly important, because I think it's important that climate policy and strategy fits in with these broader kinds of technological changes rather than being seen as completely separated. Hence the idea of a parliamentary bill which covers both automated and electric vehicles. Now, I was asked to include something on nuclear in the presentation. So one thing I wanted to flag up, given what we've heard before, is the question of public attitudes to nuclear in the UK. And I can say pretty much definitively that public attitudes are not an obstacle to the development of new nuclear in the UK. It's very interesting that at the sites where we already have nuclear plants, communities have accepted the nuclear power stations that they've got. And there are many social reasons for doing that. The sites have been there for decades. The engineers on the sites have sent their children to local schools. They're embedded in the community, and there's quite a lot of trust. There's some very interesting work I was involved in about attitudes to risk in northeast England, where there's a chemical industry, a steel industry, and a nuclear power plant. And the nuclear power plant gave rise to the least anxiety of all of these different industrial activities. So a very strong point that the communities are prepared to accept nuclear new build on existing sites. Whether there would be acceptance on a new greenfield site, I think, is a different question, but there are enough sites to expand for some time. The question about the more general public attitudes right across the country, some very interesting work done by colleagues at the University of Cardiff who did a lot of interviews and work with the general public, not on attitudes to individual technologies, but attitudes to system change in the energy sector as a whole. They discovered that people were not enthusiastic about nuclear power, but they were prepared, they used the phrase reluctant acceptance, that they would live with it. And they would especially live with it if there was a good reason, like dealing with climate change, for example, you'd have nuclear power coming through. They were especially also willing to accept it if nuclear was not on its own, but was part of a portfolio of options that included renewables and other forms of generation. And that would improve the acceptability of nuclear power if it was part of a portfolio. So, where we are on what you might call conventional reactors in the UK, we have the most advanced project is the Hinkley Point C European Pressurised Water Reactor. There has been a generic design assessment completed for the AP1000, and there is a proposal to have new expansion there. And of course, Hitachi, I think, is just about to go through the generic design assessment for the Advanced Boiling Water Reactor, which would be for the Wilva site in North Wales. So we have three major projects that are running through for nuclear in the UK. Though I have to say, since I come from Scotland, my compatriots in Scotland have decided they're not going to have nuclear power at all. They're a bit like Germans, and in that sense. But one thing I would say about the obstacles to nuclear in the UK are probably more on the economic side and financing side than they are on the public attitude side. The sums of money required to invest in a reactor and the financing costs associated with a long construction period are probably the biggest obstacle, I would say, in the UK. It's on the economic side, not on the public attitude side. And that financing aspect is why there is now an increasing amount of interest in small modular reactors in the UK, which could be built more quickly and in smaller units that didn't require such a big capital expenditure bite. So there are a number of initiatives and competitions being to work out for them. There are about 3 or 4 different small modular reactor designs that have been pitched to the government in the UK. And this is an artist's mock-up of the one that Rolls-Royce have produced based on its submarine reactors, actually. But that is as much as I was going to say. But perhaps I could just make one point, that the ambitions of the Paris Agreement are such. There is an ambition to have net zero emissions globally in the second half of the 21st century. And just as a geophysical reality, this cannot be achieved unless we're prepared to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So in one sense, carbon dioxide removal, CCS, will have to be part of the picture if we're going to achieve that net zero emissions in the second half of the 21st century. So for that, my kind of argument is that we shouldn't consider all these technologies as alternatives. We should see them as complementary parts of an overall portfolio. And I think that is what is going to be needed to get to the ambitious Paris targets. And as also the work on public attitudes in the UK demonstrates, is perhaps one that will get greater public acceptability. So I will, one word, complementary, not alternative, and not or is my final statement.